Appreciate ya. Next comment comes from Brian Casey. And he says, well, what a can of worms you've opened on the podcast front. First and foremost, the biggest problem podcasts have is discovery. Say I like the BSP in its audio form and want more podcasts in the same vein. How do I find those? Well, I can't do it on iTunes because iTunes doesn't tell me what a podcast is like and what topics they cover and how I might find another like BSP. They stick them in self-selected categories, and now it's regular business for new podcasts to list themselves in any category that even barely relates. So iTunes is and has always been useless for finding new podcasts. Now, there are a bunch of new services that list podcasts in various ways and let you search them in hopes of surfacing something you might want to listen to. And I'll pay you a nickel for every one you can name without having to search for it, because they have exactly the same problem as podcasts. You literally have to know they exist before you can search for them to find out if they exist. Podcasts and their specialist search engines cannot be discovered without already knowing they exist. The reasons for this are many, and lots of places exist that will examine those reasons. Far be it from me to step on their toes. The point is, yes, podcasts need a YouTube for podcasts, but is Spotify the sort of place that can do that? Can Spotify be YouTube for audio? Well, let me just look to see how good Spotify is at showing me new music I might like. Oh, well, podcasting is doomed. But seriously, whatever the YouTube of podcasting is going to be, someone is going to have to build it from scratch and then carefully curate it by hand rather than by algorithm. Because if I've learned one thing about recommendation algorithms from YouTube to Netflix to Spotify to Pandora to Goodreads to whatever else is out there, it is that they are universally terrible at actually showing me things I might be interested in or enjoy. Brian, thank you very much for that comment. That was quite a long one, but I read the entire thing and included it because I think you raised some interesting points. But of course, I am going to play the devil's advocate. So let's talk about bands and draw a parallel between the two. How did bands grow their fan base in the early 90s to mid 90s to late 90s to early 2000s? There was no recommendation algorithm or anything like that. It seems to be all word of mouth. That is how bands grew early on, going out on the street, flyering, doing the actual legwork rather than relying on some company to push their band and grow their audience. That's kind of where podcasting currently is. There is no algorithm saying, you need to check out BSP, you need to check out this podcast, and there's no companies pushing all of these shows. It is all word of mouth. It is all very strenuous and hard work and legwork. Getting out there, telling people about your show, and promotion, actually putting in the promotional work. Now, what about live shows? There were obviously going to be live shows where it would have an entire bill of bands, and that could be considered somewhat of a recommendation. You're going to see the headliner, and then you see 2 or 3 opening bands, and that acts as a recommendation. Oh, if you like Muse, you may also like, I don't know, some other band, Radiohead. Radiohead's opening for Muse now. This is a weird world I'm living in right now. But the parallel to podcasting here, I don't think that there's any direct comparison, but the parallel for podcasting would maybe be guest spots on other shows. You go on a larger show, and by them having you on, that is kind of them recommending your show to their existing audience. So there's a parallel there as well. And then we got music magazines. What about those? Music magazines would go ahead and have reviews of new CDs, have reviews of shows. It would tell you all sorts of information about these new and upcoming bands, these established bands, and you can buy that once a week or once a month and find out a bunch of new music. There really is no parallel for that within podcasting. So maybe there needs to be some kind of podcast magazine. It could be called Podcastage. Maybe I should do that. No, I'm not going to do that. That's too much work. But that's something that is lacking, where there's no authority really in helping people find new shows. I don't want it to be algorithm based. I agree. That's not always the best. I've had tremendous success with algorithm based discovery in terms of me finding stuff that I like. I'm not talking about me succeeding. I'm talking about YouTube being able to always recommend me another video that I cannot wait to click on. That is something that always leads me down a dark hole. But there really is no magazine parallel for podcast, and I think that would help. So with that being said, I don't know if podcasting actually has a discovery problem. All I can say is that it takes significantly more work to grow a podcast than it does a YouTube show, because YouTube does have the recommendation algorithm. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that it's good to have quite a while to practice and get better at podcasting, because if there's one thing that's true, most people who start a podcast think that they are perfect at podcasting and they are the best right from the start. And that is almost never the case, because podcasting is very similar to playing in bands. Like I said, most people think they're great when they start, but they only get good after a few years. And they would probably be horrified if their first episode was their most downloaded and one of the most listened to episodes, because most people's first episodes are trash. So I don't think that we really do have a discoverability problem. I think that we are just unfairly expecting the same kind of growth that you see on other places like YouTube. There is a main company above that has they get a direct benefit from leading you to find new videos. There is no direct entity benefiting from you finding another podcast. So there is going to be a little bit of a disconnect. No reason for a company to come in and start to recommend you or develop a way to recommend you new shows, because they don't get any monetary benefit currently. And I don't have the answer there. So that's my take on it. I think it's good that people have to work for it, because in working for it, you get better.